Hi, I'm Dr. Bruce Baker, and this is a lecture in the series on Reconstruction in the New South. And this lecture it'll be quite brief, just a sort of geographic introduction, just to sort of answer the question, where is the South? What is the South that we're talking about? And also, I suppose, what's the time period roughly? So when we think about the American South, there are different ways that we could define it, different criteria that we could use. But the main one that I want to think about here, uh, well, there's sort of two main ones. And the first of those, and I'll mention as well that I don't have slides go along with this, but it's not really necessary. I assume that you can find a map of the United States someplace with some states identified and so forth. So I'm just going to tell you what to look for and how to think about things, right? So the first way that we can define the South as a distinctive region of the United States is really sort of going back to the colonial period and the development of the economy in different of the 13 colonies that eventually become the United States, and the emphasis that is placed on the institution of slavery in some of these colonies, later states, as opposed to others. Of course, slavery existed in all of the 13 colonies at one time or another, and slavery existed well into the 19th century in probably more states than you might commonly think. But for our purposes, we want to think about, where did slavery exist at the outbreak of the Civil War? So if we think about the states of the Southeast, and let's back up here just a little bit and say, why did slavery exist? And of course, it was a labor system that was designed to maximize the agricultural productivity of large scale productive units of plantations to produce staple crops for export. And so these are things like rice, like tobacco, in a few parts of the South, sugar, although really in the period we're talking about, sugar production hasn't really taken off too much except for, well, certainly in the very early period, there's no sugar production until Louisiana is acquired in 1803, and technological changes make sugar production more possible there, starting around that time in some of the southern parishes of Louisiana. But of course, the preeminent one is cotton, which after Eli Whitney's cotton gin is invented in 1793, it's possible to grow cotton across quite a large part of the territory of the South. Not all of it, but certainly not the parts that are mountainous, particularly the Appalachian Mountains. If we think about further west in Arkansas and Missouri, the Ozarks, those higher elevation areas are not too good for cotton. But slavery develops as a labor supply system for plantation agriculture designed to export commodity crops to a global market. Now, we think about where slavery existed. As I said, at the time of the Revolution, there's slavery in all of the colonies, to a greater or lesser extent. However, at the time of the Revolution and immediately afterwards, it begins to disappear. It disappears very quickly in New England. It starts to fade out more slowly in the mid-Atlantic states, New York, Pennsylvania, Delaware. At the time of the Civil War, there's still slavery in quite a number of states. And just off the top of my head, I'll rattle off what those are. So, starting from the furthest southeast, we've got Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, Indian Territory, which is now the state of Oklahoma. Indian Territory is a peculiar sort of thing, and in a lot of ways it is the South. It's perhaps slightly different in some other ways. But Indian Territory, Arkansas, circling back, Tennessee, but also going up, going north a little bit, we've got Missouri, we have Kentucky, and then sort of sweeping around in that circle, there's Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. So I think I've covered everything. Another common way, of course, to define the American South are the states that seceded from the Union and then incorporated into the Confederate States of America during the Civil War. There are 11 of those states, and they include the ones that I just mentioned, except that there are 4 states along the border of the South which had slavery at the time of the Civil War, but didn't secede. So states that had slavery but weren't Confederate states are Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. So Kentucky certainly by really any sense is a southern state. Missouri is a lot more complicated. Missouri is, if you look at it where it's on the map, it's sort of in the middle, and it's southern and it's midwestern, it's eastern and it's western. It's sort of a mishmash of different things. In different parts of Missouri, there's a great sort of sub-state regionalism within the state of Missouri. And some parts of Missouri were more closely related by the economy. Slavery was significant in some parts of the state and not in others, and also through the demographics of where people had come from and so forth. So some parts of Missouri are very closely related to Kentucky, Tennessee. Other places are much more related to Ohio, Iowa, other places like that. But I guess the point here is that the boundaries of the South can be defined in slightly different ways, and there's some places which are definitely a part of the South, and other places, well, if you say the Confederacy, that's one set. If you say states that had slavery at the beginning of the Civil War, that's a slightly different set. I think other things sort of geographically to keep in mind and sort of get your bearings on would be, first of all, the Appalachian Mountains and the Piedmont area, which is a band of territory that starts sort of in the southern edge of Virginia and stretches through North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and into Alabama. And the Piedmont is an area of sort of rolling hills that's between the Appalachian Mountains and the coastal plain of those states. And the Piedmont eventually becomes important in this module because it's where industrialization really takes off because of the availability of water power. The important thing, I suppose, to say about the Appalachian Mountains is that the land isn't really suitable for cotton. Cotton simply doesn't grow at that elevation very well. And also the ruggedness of the terrain and also the distance from the sea means that it wasn't terribly cost effective to have large plantation units there. So Appalachia did have slavery, it did have powerful landowners, but it wasn't as dominated by slavery and plantation structures as other parts of the South. Other regions that'll be worth looking up are the Black Belt, which is an area of very dense slave population that has to do with sort of the soil conditions and basically the suitability of that area for large plantations. And so the Black Belt is an area that stretches from kind of sort of in the middle of Georgia across Alabama, across Mississippi, and you can really see a lot of sort of historic echoes of that very dense African American population there. The Sea Islands are a chain, or a sort of loose chain of barrier islands that stretch from about Charleston, South Carolina, down along most of the Georgia coast, almost to the Florida border. And those have some distinctive bits of history that we'll get to. It's also good to know the major rivers. Of course, the Mississippi River is key. The Savannah River divides South Carolina and Georgia. The Tombigbee River is significant in the area that it drains in Alabama. The Tennessee River is very important. The Ohio River marks out the northern boundary of Kentucky. So pay attention to those. And if you keep all that stuff in mind, you'll certainly have the basic sort of geographic orientation that you'll need.